Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and an exclusive that we have made inexclusive. This is a Meet the Author with a twist because it's not Meet the Author, it's Meet the Composer. If you've been paying attention to my whining over the past probably 9 months, which admittedly you probably haven't, you might have picked up on the fact that I am very excited that we have commissioned some music here on the Napoleonic Wars podcast. Now, do not despair, folks. Vivaldi is remaining firmly in place because it's Vivaldi and it's iconic. And much though my guest is a master magician musician, as I tend to refer to him, um, nobody beats Vivaldi. It's just a fact of life. Feel free to disagree with me in the comments because you are entitled to be wrong, but you are nonetheless wrong. Um, but having now received those tracks, it was a really exciting opportunity to look into the art behind trying to create music that works in a historical documentary setting, which is the point of this work that we have commissioned here on the show. So, joining me as ever are some of the Patreon supporters. And if you're interested in attending other sessions like this, head over to Patreon to find out how you can join those sessions. But I am joined by, as I say, the magician musician, the master of the craft, Lee Boys, who is a composer and teacher in England, an all round good egg, professional guitarist. He's been composing and producing music for over 20 years at this point, classically trained, and plays a whole range of instruments: acoustic guitar, electric guitar, bass, does backing vocals. Don't worry, I'm not about to break out into song this evening because we'd probably get a content warning because it would be that kind of grating on your ears. Lee, it's an absolute joy to welcome you to the show. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, and thank you for such a boisterous introduction there. That's it's quite humbling. Thank you for letting me on the show.
Not at all. Boisterous intros are what we do on this show. I like to
Good,
think that we do it
good.
quite well. I'm going to start with the kind of the fundamentals, the basics of this. Just talk us. Here's a really nice, simple question to open with. Talk us through what's involved in composing a piece of music, Lee. But but for a lot of our listeners, they generally tune in because it's a history show,
Yeah.
and what we sat down to do was kind of bring the history into the composition process, which is not easy. So before we get into the sort of how you then start to integrate the historical stuff, when you're trying to envisage a track, where do you start?
Um, well, I start by actually looking to reference material. So you recall in our first discussions, I was really pushing you to share with me as much in the way of ideas from yourself to get as good a picture as possible of approximately what you were hearing in your head, um, but also your particular tastes and musical predilections. Um, as composers, we don't compose in a vacuum. We compose in a continuum. Um, so as soon as you'd passed on reference material to me, then immediately I was listening from the point of view of thinking what aspects or features I might reflect in the music I went on to write. Um, and when it gets to the question of composing a particular piece, the starting point is improvisation, essentially. Um, so with each track, it would be a case of deciding whether I needed to write a melodic theme of some kind and have that pinned in place, or whether I was going to write some sort of harmonic progression, chord progression that would be the central driving idea, and then build everything up around that. And then it's a case of just trying out different ideas until I found something that was an approximation. And then you start whittling away at it to get it sitting where you want it. And once that's in place, you can I can with my the ear equivalent of a mind's eye, I immediately start to hear things that will fall into place. I'll hear a certain line on a certain instrument, and so I'll put that in. And then with that playing, I can then hear something else that should fit, and it builds up over time. Um, yeah, more or less.
It's so I have a little bit of musical training, very, very, very hefty emphasis on a little bit. I kind of don't think my grade six violin quite equates to the skills that you need to do this kind of thing. But in the process of that, they sort of same story actually with my GCSE music. They sort of they let you think you're having a go at sort of doing these things like composing and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And it's all very sort of sweet and um, frankly, I would listen back to the tracks and think, what moron wrote this, and find that the answer is me, and so therefore the epithet of moron would entirely fit. Um, but I find it really fascinating because you've referred to this process that we had here, where we sat down for quite some time and talked about different styles and different kind of what the music would look like. Um, Granted, you also had some previous work to go back on because Waterloo by Air Part One was already out, and so you knew kind of the style that I was going to draw on it and some of the sort of ideas and moods that I wanted to create through that. But then, I mean, the best example of this was what we called Muraz March,
Mm.
which was the last piece of music that we worked on together, where I gave you these kind of different ideas. And for context, folks, I'm sort of throwing out suggestions like think the scene at the end of Star Wars Episode 4, where they're in the throne room and you've got that sort of Force theme march. If you don't know what I'm referring to, just YouTube it. You'll find it easily enough. It's the point where Han Solo and Luke Skywalker are both giving Leia the eye, um, both thinking, "Oh, hello," and they're being given medals. And there's this sort of very kind of upbeat, triumphalist, huzzah, boys, we've won kind of mood to it. And I was kind of throwing ideas like that at you, and then not really kind of knowing what the net result would be. But then I heard the outcome. Now we're not going to play Muraz March because you need to tune into the documentaries to hear all of the masterpieces. But I heard it and kind of went, oh, that's an interesting take on what you'd put together. And so I wonder how you sort of how you take somebody as prescriptive as me, because shock to listeners, I'm quite demanding, and I was quite particular in terms of the brief that I gave you. Um, how do you deal with a diva who sort of turns around and goes, "I want this, and I want it sort of Hans Zimmer with maybe a hint of Brian Tyler"? If folks don't know who Brian Tyler and Hans Zimmer are, then you're going to need to spend copious amounts of time on Spotify listening to some of the best film music that's ever been written this century. How do you deal with that? Because at the core of this is your creative process and your way of doing things. And yet you've got this diva sort of chirping in your ear, going, "But I want power and I want this, that, and the other." How does that kind of work within this process? Because it does mean that you can't just write what you want to write. Do you know what I mean?
Well, to be honest, um, doing anything like this, you very rarely can. The only time you can have complete freedom is when you're just writing for your own pleasure. What you describe as being a real diva and very demanding, actually, for me, was the ideal client, because you gave me all this fantastic reference uh, material and reference points, and I could therefore look at it from lots of different angles and decide what I was going to take from where. So, I mean, the example of Murat's March. the second main section of that. So there's a big fanfare start, and then it goes into a big section that builds on the brass, and then it goes into a contrasting section, just to give a bit of a breathing space and to add some light and shade. And I turned round to the throne room scene, and I looked at what John Williams had done, and he had this kind of walking movement in the double basses, um, and a slight shift in tonality. And I thought, well, I could do something like that in terms of the orchestration, but obviously write something completely different. So I could use all these reference points to to inform what I was putting together. And I mean, something I found remarkable was that there was so little in terms of change requests from yourself, to be honest. I mean, you describe yourself as a diva, but there was so little that I had to do in terms of changes or reworks, because essentially what I was sending you, you were turning around going, yes, with exclamation marks. Um, Now, compare that to, for example, when I did my biggest game contract. And in a situation like that, various composer producers are contacted to say, we're looking for someone to buy in to write the music for this game. Um, and so everybody gets the same brief. And it was some pictures from the game design as it was at that stage, a description of the target audience, and um, one track by one band as an example of the kind of flavor. And that was it. That was everything you had. And this was for the equivalent of writing the music for an entire online game for children, for the equivalent of a BBC TV series. Um, so it's, you're not talking AAA list or anything, but it's reasonably high level. That was the entirety of the brief initially, and you had to write a track and send that in, and then the end client would choose the track they wanted. And then, because they chose mine, and they said, right, we want to use your theme, but now you need to rework it in these various different styles. And so for each area within the game, I had to rework the music. Um, and again, in those situations, it was like, we've got a science lab, so we want something sciencey. And we've got a jungle area, so we want a jungly sort of arrangement. That was it. The no more guidance than that. So the fact that you were giving me all these reference points, as I say, we don't compose in a vacuum. Stravinsky said, good composers borrow, great composers steal. And he wasn't advocating for outright plagiarism. He was advocating for looking to the music around you, and if you hear a voicing in an orchestral arrangement that you think, oh, I really like the way they voiced that chord, use it. That's good composing. So you just gave me lots and lots of wonderful material to use as my starting point, my inspiration.
I suppose that there's a version of this interview where I suddenly become very smug. Um, and go, well, this is just clearly I had a vision and I communicated that so well, and Huzzah isn't Emperor
Clearly.
Zach wonderful. Surprisingly enough, that's not how I even get applause from Lee. That's very generous of you. Surprisingly enough, that's not how this is going to go, um, because I did find it unnerving, actually, particularly the further we got along this process. I mean, Muraz March being the last one, you just sent me a theme, and I went, "Yeah, that's I can't ask for any more." And equally, we have a piece, Berthier's Study, which you're going to hear a little bit later. That again, that was just kind of instantaneously, yeah, that fits what I need. for that scenario. So I'm going to say it's down to you. Like you're the one with the skills, hence why I call you the magician musician. Um, let's start talking about specifics. Actually, I'm going to start
Okay.
with the Corsican Lament, partly because I really love the historicity of this and the cultural nod. So for just to set the scene for folks, initially we discussed four tracks. In the end, we ended up going to five. And essentially, what I wanted was something with a sort of lament style theme that I predominantly envisaged as um, sort of after the battle music, that kind of sense of everybody's dead and the soldier is looking over the battlefield at the destruction of his battalion or his comrades, and something that really kind of stuck, that basically grips your heartstrings, because I am using all of this music to add layers of emotion on top of a narration that attempts to be emotive. So it's about kind of really pulling on the heartstrings. And so I needed something that just kind of turned that emotion up to 11. So I asked for a lament. I asked for essentially a battle theme of sorts, something that could be a sort of campaign theme. And then the fourth one sort of ended up being a bit kind of wishy-washy, something sort of victory-esque, but not too triumphalist. And then we sort of broke that down and went with the Muraz march, and then sort of because the lament was so good, I kind of didn't need something that sort of brought sort of the mourning into the victory, and instead we went with the sort of the Berthier study thing, which is a kind of setting the scene. The historian going on a research journey or transitioning from one site to another, all of those kinds of things. So the first one we're going to look at this evening, we're going to look at three of the five pieces. The first one we're looking at is the Corsican's Lament, and you came highly recommended. I won't embarrass the individual who did recommend you to me, but I'm hugely grateful to them for doing so. But I could tell, you were a pro at this. That the way you kind of sat down, we had these meetings, we talked at length about different styles and sort of picked through the things that I wanted. You were kind of gently kind of saying, well, actually, you're talking about wanting a Brian Tyler, but what you're saying you enjoy is much more sort of a Williams or a Zimmer style of composition. And we had all of this. And then you went away and you said, I found something for the lament. And I want you to tell this story because it's your creative process. But at that point, I just went, wow, this guy, this flaming guy. So I was deeply impressed, and my respect for you deepened at this point. But please tell us the story of how you got to the Corsican's Lament.
Well, again, it's actually starts with you because you one of the words you used in those discussions was this word lament, and that was the seed of the idea because um, it's a term in folk music for a type of sorrowful folk song. So I'm, driving between schools, doing my teaching work, thinking this over, thinking how am I going to go about this? And I was thinking along the lines very quickly of some sort of folk music. Um, and I thought, well, English folk music that I have some familiarity with feels a bit risky to lean towards because there might be too much familiarity in the ear of the listener. So I thought then about looking to French folk music, and it occurred to me that there are a lot of people out there in the past sort of 40, 50 years that have done what we would call field recordings. So they go out with some sort of recording device and they go out to remote villages in countries all over the place and talk to people and get them to sing and play what they know. And being an oral tradition, you get quite an immediate experience of the sound of what was actually maybe 100 years ago. or more, because it's just a few generations down, and it's an oral tradition. So I actually looked around to see if I could find any field recordings of folk songs that might give me a hint of what a French lament folk song might have sounded like in the time of Napoleon. And to my delight, I found a particular album which had two tracks that really jumped out to me. One was called A Corsican Lament. So, well, that was a no-brainer. And then another one was called Jean Renaud. And it was a sorrowful song about a soldier returning from battles with his tripes in his hand. That is actually the first line. When Jean Renaud returned with his tripes in his hand. So he's returning from the battle, he's mortally wounded, and he's being carried home to die. So I took those two songs and I transcribed the melodies of the singer. I put them into the same tonal center so they were working together. And I just sat and analyzed what was actually going on in the music that gave it its particular flavor, its particular characteristics that made it sound like French period folk songs. And once I picked out what I thought were the aspects that gave it those characteristics, I set myself to use those characteristics to write what I hoped would be a lament theme that wouldn't sound out of place in the early 1800s in a French village, and that became the driving concept of the whole piece. And then it was a case of orchestrating around it and building it into a full length work of, I think in the end it was getting on for about 5 minutes in the end, the longest of the tracks.
I mean, we'll say a little bit more about the the artistic devices that you've got going on in there. I don't want to spoil what folks are about to listen to. What we're going to do, folks, is play you that track. If you're watching this either on YouTube or on the Spotify video cast version of the app, you'll also be able to see some video playing in the background because it's the Corsican Lament. I was very fortunate to go to Corsica on work a few months ago, and having taken some video footage, I thought it made perfect sense to plaster video of Corsica over the top of the music. So if you're wondering what the visuals are about, that's the reasoning for it. Quite obviously, this is not how the Napoleonic Wars pod does its documentary video editing. It's just a very quick, rough and ready thing to sort of tickle your fancy. But this is the Corsican's Lament. To say that I love it would be something of an understatement. Hopefully, that came through for folks joining us on the live version of this Meet the Author session. That was the Corsican's Lament. And we said before we played the track that there was going to be an element of talking about the different ideas, the sort of historical nods that you were working into the piece. And I didn't actually realize that that was how you were going about this until you raised this. And then as soon as you said it, I started hearing equivalents and other things that you'd done. I could kind of see where you were going. So talk us through that because there is a conversation that's going on in that piece.
Yeah, well, I got to a point with this piece where the central lament. So you've got the introductory sort of scene setting, if you like, section, which from a practical point of view, I was also writing for thinking in terms of something that you could loop easily to extend to support content, because I knew that when it came to the lament, it wouldn't be so easy to break up into chunks. So I wanted to provide you some sort of material that was easily loopable, as well as having this larger piece of material. But I found that when I got to the lament section there, violin and piano, my initial assumption was that that is how it would be. It would be the violin supported by the piano. But I felt like there was something missing. And it happened that at the time, to sort of keep my head in the right space, I was also reading my way through Simon Scarrow's novelization of Napoleon and Wellington, the quadrilogy. Um, and so the relationship between Napoleon and Josephine comes up in that. And so my mind was sort of riffing around with this. It's the Corsican's Lament. So while this music has the function of thinking from the point of view of all the lives lost of the soldiers, which was something less of a problem from Napoleon's point of view than it was for many. Um, there's also utility in it for, the mood of Napoleon when he's finally beaten, for example, and things like that. And so I had this idea of, well, if the violin were thought of as Napoleon's voice, then perhaps there could be another voice that is Josephine. And the cello seemed to be the right timbre for that. Um, in some respects, it's maybe counterintuitive to have the female voice to be the lower register and this higher voice to be the male. But in terms of the relationship and roles between them, there was this strength that's in Josephine, and there's an element I get the impression from what I'm no historian, but there's an impression I get that there was something rock-like about Josephine that Napoleon held to, if you like, in certain respects. So to have the cello as this stronger, richer, more sonorous voice, um, and, and then I from that started to weave the two together and actually have them counterpointing each other, um, never sort of arguing or disagreeing, but push and pull, tension and resolution. But then at the end, they sort of meet to finish off. So that became a sort of a narrative that I used to help me find a way to make the music as expressive as possible, really.
Also, it's a known on this show that I'm much more of a fan of Josephine than I am of Napoleon. So having this sort of stronger, richer voice for Josephine absolutely works for me. I had no objections to that whatsoever. And I do regularly bash Napoleon for being a narcissist. So their sort of whiny or whinier tone that is so typical of violins kind of resonates quite well with me on
Yeah,
many levels.
and he's the one that's doing the cadenza, if you like, when the string orchestra takes over the theme. He's the one that's doing all the showing off over the top and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, so I loved this piece. I must admit, I it took me a little while. I had to listen to it a few times to really kind of feel whether or not it was going to work for me. For all that we've kind of talked about, oh, this was an absolute joy of a process. In the early phase, as we were kind of learning what I wanted and how we could kind of go about constructing that, um, there were sort of a few versions that you would send me, and it took me a while to sort of I would have to sort of listen to it, go away, sort of make sure there was no other distractions. It kind of took me back to, ironically enough, sort of the GCSE days of when you actually were meant to properly listen to music just for the sake of listening to music, as
Yeah.
opposed to doing it as part of sort of the background noise filler in your everyday life. So it was quite a nice kind of experience myself. But once you sort of you talk about kind of your ears I know that's a contradiction in terms, but
My
kind of like,
mind's ear is what I
yeah,
call it.
indeed,
Mind's ear
indeed.
instead of mind's eye.
Um, for me, there is a camera reel that can kind of roll, and I can kind of take the music and kind of slot it into certain scenarios that I know I will end up creating, because there are certain tropes in documentary making that are always there, kind of going on a journey, kind of bringing things full circle, that kind of A
Yeah.
B or A B C style of sequencing, your 3 act structure.
Hmm.
Um, so it was really interesting to kind of go, okay, can I see this kind of fitting with the drone footage? Are there certain tones and moods and narrations that I can make work with it? So it was kind of a symbiotic process in the end, in terms of kind of working out how does this all slot together. We're going to give you another one now. Lee, do you think we should give them Berthier's Study or The Forlorn Hope?
I think go with Berthier's study first.
That's a good choice.
Save forlorn for hope for afterwards.
Indeed, indeed. So the rationale behind Berthier's study was, I've alluded to this already, and if you've watched Waterloo by Air Part One, you'll probably immediately twig where I'm going with this, because in any documentary there is this trope of, here's a problem, and I'm a historian and I'm going to take you on a journey whilst I go and investigate that problem. And the reality, of course, is that it's all Hollywood and nonsense. And we've worked out what the resolution to that problem is before we've even started writing the scene where we go, here's the problem. Um, but nonetheless, if you're going to do that, or if you're going to kind of move from one site to another, so for example, you arrive at a monument and you talk about a particular aspect of the battle. So, for example, the Hanoverian contribution to Waterloo. Well, that's great. But if you're going to then move things on, you need that transitional space, and you need some music to kind of mark that transition. And this is where Berthier's study comes in for both of those situations. And it's a wonderfully simple piece of music, because it's one of those moments where what I need is, it sounds so kind of crass to describe it as filler, but I need something that just kind of sets a tone of mobility, of thinking, but that really doesn't intrude, because what matters in that moment is the narration, but the narration on its own sounds dry. So you need something that isn't intrusive to the process. And so this is the masterpiece that we have. And for those of you watching this on YouTube or via the Spotify video app, you're going to be treated to some quite nice, I'm going to say, drone footage of some key locations from Waterloo. this is something that is, it could very easily be an earworm. But there's a reason for that. It's designed to be an earworm because it's very editable from my perspective and very loopable. But Lee, tell us about the creative process here, because this was actually something that ended up being much easier than I suspect either of us anticipated.
Yeah, this, I mean, the other tracks took, I didn't count how many hours, but many hours to create. Um, but Berthier's study, I think, took me about 2 hours from complete start to finish, with the exception of the mastering process at the end. But the track I sent you for sign off, I think, took me about 2 hours to do. Um, Partly because of the function of it, it meant that it had to be simple in terms of structure. So from a composing point of view, what you have there in actual fact is a repeated um, piano motif with a falling bass line, and that just cycles round and round and round. And in order to provide variety from one section to another, um, I just gradually build up the layers of strings that are playing. Um, and the function of the strings is to do what we call in the business planing. So they're not playing any melody. Um, they're not shifting chords because the chord is established by that piano motif. So they're just all just moving around that piano motif that's holding them in place. But there has to be some movement, otherwise it sounds too static. Um, but what actually made it even easier was um, you sent me some footage where you'd used some stock music, and it just so happened that the stock music that you'd used um, reminded me uncannily of a piece I'd actually written back in my teens. The first full piece I'd ever written for a piano. I actually wrote it because my grandparents sent me their piano when I was doing my A levels, so that I could study some keyboard skills because I discovered I needed some piano level of piano skill to do an undergraduate degree in music. So they sent me their piano, and so one of the first things I did once I got the piano was compose a piece on it. It's in fact it's the piano right here in my studio. I still have it now. It's my Bechstein, and I love it dearly. So I took the piece I'd written back in my teens, shifted it into the right tonality, so that if you transition from Berthier's study to one of the other tracks I've written, there's a natural flow. It doesn't suddenly leap to a new key. Um, and then I changed what I'd originally written on the piano to give slightly more complexity to the piano motif. So there's more movement, there's more for the ear to catch on to. The ear's heard it 2 or 3 times, but then if it tunes back into the piano, there are things that it can pick up on that it didn't notice the first time round. Um, so I added some complexity to that. But once I'd pinned that in place, then it was literally just layering in the strings and having them planing musically around it, which for me is not too big a challenge really.
One of the things that really surprised me from all of this is that I'd gone in with Waterloo by Air Part One, and I'd got my music, and I thought this is perfect. You know, I found, as you can imagine, you know, a lot of research goes into finding the right pieces,
Mm.
thinking very carefully about what goes in. But you don't just sort of sling in a piece of music and sort of hope for the best. You've got to be very particular, and it's one of those things that I will actually toot my own horn for once and say I do well. Nobody understands why. Probably a little bit of musical training, probably just a lot of trial and error. Um, but it's one of those things where I've got an ear for this works and creates a certain mood, and that's what I want. And I going into this process, I was kind of trepidatious about whether or not I was going to get something where I could go, I'm as happy with that as I am with what originally, I sourced, but we can use it because it's royalty free, but we then lose all of our revenue because of the way that YouTube operates, and it takes all of the ad revenue and it gives them to the composers. And I'm fully up with supporting indie content creators because we are an indie content creator, but at the same time, when you're producing content and not earning anything from it, that's not okay. Hence this process. Um, and as I say, I wasn't like I had confidence in you that you'd produce something stellar. What I couldn't be confident of was whether I'd sit back at the end and go, yeah, that's as good, if not better, than what I had originally. And it was remarkable how you just sort of came around. I think it was the next day. It might even have been sort of the next morning and just gone, yep. Yeah. So I went for a walk, had a bit of a think. I've come up with this. What do you think? I just went, yep, that's perfect. Job done. Um, it was remarkable. You said something there about mastering,
Mm.
and we will come to Forlorn Hope, but I want to end with Forlorn Hope. Um, I keep kind of wondering which is my favorite of them because I think of them as a suite. So we
Mm.
called them the Eagle Suite,
Mm.
as a nod, quite obviously, to Napoleonic history and the French Eagle. Um, but I keep wondering which is my favorite, and it might be Forlorn Hope,
Mm.
but it might be Corsican Lament. I can't quite decide
Yeah,
out of the two.
for me, it's my favorite. The one I'm proudest of is the Corsican's Lament.
Mm.
Um, but um, I
I
wouldn't
th-
be surprised if you chose something like Forlorn Hope, knowing your sort of tastes in film music and things like that. Yeah, I can imagine. Mm.
our discussions precede me in that
Yeah.
regard, but I think I love the historicity that's embedded into the Corsican Lament. That kind of
Mm.
sense of going and looking at these sort of these folk tunes from the period that the oral history traditions, Corsica being very strong in terms of its oral history tradition as well. Um, so I think from a creative journey perspective, I think I prefer Corsican's Lament. But I think in terms of as a piece of music to just sit and listen to, I think I probably sort of lean towards Forlorn Hope, which, as
Forlorn
you say,
Hope.
is just a reflection of my tastes. But you were sorry, folks, that was a roundabout circle. But what I was going to ask you about was the mastering process that you talked about. I was staggered that this was even a thing
Mm.
because effectively you sent me these tracks and I kind of sort of prodded and poked a little bit and said, look, can we sort of take this up a step, particularly in relation to Forlorn Hope, actually? And can we sort of tweak little things around the edges? Um, and then you sort of sent me a thing and I went, yeah, okay, that's lovely. That's, as far as I'm concerned, that's that track done. And you went, well, no, 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 we're not done. That's just the draft, the draft process completed. Like I'm going to go away and do all of this production stuff. And I went, but why? Like I've got a piece of music. It sounds very good. Thank you very much. I'm quite happy. Explain the why to us.
Yeah. So there are a few things to this. One of the main things is when I'm composing here, where I'm sat, what you can't see behind the camera is a pair of studio monitor speakers. Um, they're quite different from the speakers of something like a consumer hi-fi system, um, in that they're very warts and all. In fact, the studio monitors that I have, what's said about them is if they sound good on this, they sound good on everything. Um, but the thing is, the type of detail and things like that is not what you would want to listen to as a consumer, because it would get fatiguing on the ear. The detail and the precision, it doesn't massage the sound. So when you finish doing all the work of creating the piece of music, you then have to essentially prepare the music so that it will sound as good as possible no matter what device or listening source is being used. And of course, in this day and age, if this is music underneath a YouTube video and someone's watching it on their smartphone and they're just listening out of the little tinny speaker, you're going to lose most of the bottom end. There was no point writing any sub bass um, uh, stuff to go underneath your tracks, even if it had been appropriate for your kind of music, because half the time no one's going to hear it. Um, so the mastering process, one of the reasons for it is to actually prepare it for consumer systems, so that it'll sound hopefully good on laptop speakers, on a smartphone, or watching it on telly or whatever. Um, so that's one thing. Another thing is in terms of actually getting the level consistent across the tracks so that you're not having to do a lot of extra work if you're using a bit from one track and then moving on to a bit from another. That wants to be seamless as possible. Then, because I knew YouTube was one of the main target points for the music, there are certain production values that YouTube optimizes for. And if you impinge on certain limitations, it can actually harm the success of the video, because or it can, or at the very least, the it will bring in automatic what's called normalization, where the YouTube algorithms will actually start to clamp down on the sound to get it under control. Now, that's less of a concern for yourself if you've got it running under dialogue, because the music isn't the main volume anyway. But if you're doing a silent drone shot with music underneath, and therefore the music is center stage, and I haven't mastered it for use on YouTube, you might actually find that what you hear back from the finished video on YouTube strangely doesn't sound quite as good as when you'd actually edited it and prepared it and uploaded it. And that's because I have potentially not done my job in terms of mastering it for YouTube. So that's another consideration. But also in the mastering process, you do a certain set of things that basically just opens out the sound and brings it to life and gives it more energy overall. When I'm actually composing and producing, initially, I'm being very careful about the relative levels of the instruments, and I'm keeping an eye on what the maximal volume is on the master channel and making sure I'm leaving what we call headroom, so it's not getting too close to clipping, things like that. And I'm doing certain things to do with things like what we call reverb and EQ, but only to a certain degree, because I'm focusing on the composing and structuring a good piece. But no matter how great the sound samples are that you're working with, the sample library. I mean, we used the BBC Symphony Orchestra as orchestral library for the orchestral sounds. They sound great, but you can't just chip that out and it's fine. You've got to actually use things like compressors and saturation and EQ to really bring the sound to life at the end. So it's those finishing touches, I think, are really, really important. And it's actually one of the hardest steps in the whole process for me. It's the one I find hardest to do of all of it, really. And I know in terms of my own, let's say, as a recording artist, as a guitarist, if I were to record another album, it's quite possible that, whereas with my first album I mastered it myself, it's quite possible that if I were to do another album, I would actually send it to a mastering engineer, because they do, it's what they do all the time. and they would quite probably bring to bear a better result than I would myself. I'd probably master it myself and then compare it to the mastering engineer's version, but I would very much anticipate that their mastering job would be better than mine because it's quite a particular craft. Um, and I mean, hopefully you found when you heard the what I was calling the draft and the mastered versions, hopefully you were able to hear the difference between the two.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Actually, I didn't expect. I expected you to sort of send me this finalized version. I kind of go, "That's great, thanks, Lee," and then I'd sort of privately be thinking, "Sounds exactly like the original thing." And then I heard it and I went, "Oh my God!" Kind of because there is a step change
Yeah.
between the two. Having said that, I did then actually complain to you, didn't I, on one very specific point in
Mm.
relation to Forlorn Hope, because in the process it sort of brought down the choral facet, and I kind of went,
Yeah. Can
but
I have
I
a bit more of
need
that,
the
please?
choral. I
Yeah.
need to have that point where I can just turn it right up to 11,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is the
Yeah.
point of the choral section. And in
Yeah.
fact, this was one of our conversations as we start to move towards playing you guys Forlorn Hope. Um, this was one of the conversations that we had over this piece, was that need for it to build and progress and progress.
Mm.
I should say we didn't plan to call it Forlorn Hope. We didn't plan on any of these names initially. They're just things that literally sort of fell out of listening to these tracks.
I wanted to ask, actually, if I may. I came across the term forlorn hope when I was reading the Simon Scarrow novels. It came up a few times when he's writing about Wellington's campaign across the Iberian Peninsula, and he described the volunteers that were in first when they'd breached like at Badajoz, for example, those volunteers from his army that went in first to try and get through the breach, they were described as the forlorn hope. Is that where the title comes from?
That's exactly it.
Right.
Because I listened to it and I thought entirely of Badajoz,
Mm,
and having been there, admittedly, a couple of years ago now, but I could just kind of sort of stand there in my mind's eye and kind of strip away the road that now runs through the Greater Breach, um, strip away the parkland and the palm trees, and just sort of imagine nighttime cannon fire. Sort of it again, the way that it builds, you sort of got this sense of impending unease, the sense of sort of building up to that the tension builds and it builds, and then you move into this sense of cannons going off everywhere. I mean, what I'm now doing is answering the question I was going to put to you, which is kind of to talk about the different sort of artistic elements in this. But you, if you want to, and all of this is about an interpretive process, right? But if you want to sort of listen to it in a certain way, you can kind of hear this sort of cries of people who are wounded, sort of officers bellowing orders, that sense of desperation of we've been discovered, this attack isn't going to work, but with a forlorn hope, we've got to keep going, because if we go backwards, we're going to get hit by canister fire. If we go forwards, we're going to get a musket ball in our face. So we might as well go forwards, because otherwise we're just going to sit in a ditch and people are going to lob burning bundles of whatever at us. Um, and this was why I was always kind of pushing for, okay, can we take this up a level? I need it to go up several notches. Hence the conversation post mastering of, we've got this choral section, it sounded fantastic, but now the volume's come down and it's quietened it out, and I need
yeah.
to have that sort of epic hero boss fight at the end of a video game. Do you know what I mean? Um, and the end result was fantastic. And it absolutely, I was actually really relieved when you sent me a doctored version that meant we still had that.
Mm,
Because it, for me, it's what completes the piece.
mm.
And as you say, it's very me in terms of my taste. I think it sort of leans very sort of Hans Zimmer, Brian Tyler in terms of. I mean, you may disagree, like you're the one who actually understands music,
Oh
but
yeah, I would agree. Yeah, not
sort
as
of the
good as
others are
them, but
very
yeah.
sort of John Williams esque in many places, um, or at least I think they are. Whereas this is sort of that Brian Tyler sort of. It's not quite superhero music. It's not quite Batman, but it's sort of it's. I suspect it's actually playing on some kind of techniques and sort of tropes that they use. Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. So, you remember I was saying earlier about how my starting point would be to decide, does this need to be melodic theme driven or does it need to be harmonically driven? With this one, it for me it needed to be harmonically driven. So I pinned in place a harmonic progression, and you'd you'd cited um, some Batman and things like that. So I was doing some listening. In fact, I think I listened to the Batman Returns album, and was it? I think there were a couple of tracks from that album, Anthracis, I think it's called, and Nictaris, I think. So if anyone listening wants to go and check out the Batman Returns album, and listen to those, you might hear something of a nod of the head there, in terms of my choice of the harmonic progression. It's not the same chord sequence by any means, but there's a nod of the head there. Um, yeah, yeah.
Okay, folks, we won't keep you waiting with bated breath anymore. This is the last piece of the five that we're going to play you. We're not giving you all five, we're just giving you three. But this is The Forlorn Hope. Okay, and in the sort of background there, you will have heard some musket fire if you were just listening to this episode. For those of you who are watching it either on Spotify video or on YouTube, you will of course have seen our resident reenactor Liam Telfer putting himself through the paces in terms of musketry, culminating in a repeat of that 4 rounds a minute footage that featured on a previous YouTube video. And for the first time, actually, having put all of these videos together over the last couple of days with that intent of having something visual over the top of it, it actually struck me that having the video detracts from the music. And it's, I, uh, I'm lost for words because, of course, the whole point of having these pieces of music written was that they were meant to sort of supplement the video. And actually, the power balance is inverted, I think, when it
Mm.
comes to Forlorn Hope. It has a power to it. And the video, for me, actually ends up being the distraction because I kind of want people to just listen to the music. Um, I'm curious actually whether folks have also found that. If so, drop us a comment and let us know your thoughts. But I would actually urge you to just rewind that bit and not watch the screen. Just shut your eyes, which is how I listened to all of these tracks in the first place. Just shut your eyes and listen to the music because I think then actually you get something else entirely from the music. Lee, let me get your reaction to that because I mean, these are your babies, if you will, your musical babies. Um, and here I am, sort of slinging in sort of drone footage here, or people mucking around with muskets there. How how does it feel? Because in one sense, sort of the this is the organic nature of what these pieces were designed for. But at the same time, you've got somebody who's kind of taking your work and just kind of mucking around and experimenting with video stuff over the top of it.
I mean, I just think it's really, really cool. That's what's happening. Throughout the entire process, the function of the music was the most important thing to me. As much as I put my heart and my soul into it because, well, it's the only way I can compose. Um, I was always very clear on what the function of the music was. It worries me slightly that you feel like that power balance has changed in any way because it makes me think, oh, have I overdone the music? Maybe I should have somehow, not driven in so hard with some of the themes, perhaps, so that it's easier for it to sit under footage. Um, so that's my first concern, really, my primary concern. And I mean, I I structured the music so that you can completely destroy the piece in terms of its musical shape. Um, so it should be fine for you to go, right, I'm going to repeat this chunk ad nauseum because that serves my purpose. As a piece of music, if you listen to it then, it's it's going to get yawn. Um, but it will be serving its purpose in that respect. Um, so I just think it's really cool to actually see it and see what you do in terms. I mean, things like there's one of the rises that I put in there, and you timed it really nicely to go off with the firing of the musket and things like that, and that's really satisfying to watch from my point of view, to see you using the devices that I've dropped in there, hoping that you will find utility in them. That's very exciting. It was an interesting challenge for me, really, because it's more like a game music composer's approach, where you you don't know how long a player is going to spend in a certain environment and when they're going to trigger off an interaction. And so you have to have music that can loop round, but then can move in one direction or another depending on what they trigger off in the environment. and so I was trying to take that kind of approach with it, because there's no one piece of footage that I'm writing the music for. There's no Mickey Mousing my music to particular scenes. And in some respect, that it felt a bit like composing with one hand tied behind my back. Because, I mean, for example, the piece we just listened to there, um, it's just four chords, and they go round and round and round and round, and that four chord harmony never ever changes. And Flight of the Emperor, it's just two chords, and they just oscillate from one to the other. So actually keeping interest in the music for 2 3 minutes without being able to shift that, because if I do shift it to a new tonal center, then you've got no way of bringing it back without it sounding disjunct. Was quite an interesting challenge, really. And that, that was part of the fun. It was a bit brain breaking at times, but a process like this is always brain breaking in some way. So there's always something that causes problems. So it's fine.
In terms of that worry, I mean, I must say, having so this is a double-edged thing because on the one hand, this is the first time I've set any of the music to video in a dedicated way. Um, so this is the first sort of outing for the music, sort of in the guise that it was always intended for. Up until this point, I've always listened to this music either to sort of really pick it apart and think, am I happy with this? Does this do what I need it to do? Or having sort of fallen in love with the tracks, or just listened to it for fun. So this was the first time that I'd sort of worked with it, and having sat down to put those videos together, I was very much in the editorial mindset, and you picked up on this yourself. Those the timing isn't accidental. This is absolutely, you shoot certain bits of footage for certain bits of effect, and you always have certain bits of footage that you will use more because they serve a particular purpose. So absolutely, it's not an accident that the gun fires at the moment that you have the clash of the cymbals. That is a trope that's a hook that you've left me, and I'm not going to just let that pass on by. Do you know what I mean? This
Yeah.
is exactly the point of why we've done this exercise. Um, but I must say I didn't notice it for the others. I wonder if it's that there is throughout the video material that I put into Forlorn Hope, you've got Liam running around doing his thing, and it's meant to sort of be much more mobile and sort of excitable because that's the nature of the piece. And I just wonder, perhaps with all of the musket firing, whether I've just created something that's a little bit too distracting. I mean, the reality is that you've everything you've heard today is at a particular volume that will never be heard probably ever again in this music's life, because I will take
Mm.
um the volume and I will bring it right down by something in the region of 8 to 10, maybe even 12 decibels in places,
Yeah.
and I'll play around with that. But the music will always be much, much more muted.
Yeah.
Um, and so it will kind of sit there, and it will just be sort of this thing that sort of you're not conscious of, but it's just there in a corner of your ear, kind of setting that tone and playing on those emotions that little bit more.
Mm.
Um, but I suspect it's probably sort of the intended purpose of that video being for folks to sort of sit down and enjoy the piece. And actually, even I was watching that and kind of thinking, actually, I'm being drawn more to whatever Liam's doing in a particular shot rather than the music. So I suspect that's actually just an editing fail on my
Mm.
part, which is what happens when you finish editing a video at midnight. Um, Lee, it's been an absolute joy to talk to you. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and taking us
Yeah.
through the creative process behind this. Just tell folks how they can find out more about you and your work, and if they're of a mind to get a piece commissioned, maybe for a loved one, or I don't really know what people generally commission music for, but then I didn't know that people commission music for YouTube documentaries until I started this process. But if folks would like to know more about your work, equally, if they're a sort of wannabe guitarist and are interested in sort of looking at being tutored by you, just give folks a sense of what you do, what they might be able to hire you to do, and how they can do that.
Okay. Well, I do spend most of my week teaching. I teach around schools in West Yorkshire. The rest of my working time is free to take on projects, and I basically I I'm not in a situation where I go chasing after the project or touting for business. I just let word of mouth do its thing and see what comes my way. And if there's a project that appeals to me, then I'll go for it. Um, so, you know, over the past year or so, I found myself editing guitar tutorial books, coaching professional musicians, um, composing and arranging, working as a recording artist, producing for other musicians, um, and composing bespoke music. So, yeah, I'm available for all of that, and any other project, no matter how outlandish, because the teaching is my bread and butter. I have the luxury of being able to just pick and choose the projects that really inspire and excite me. So if anybody has a novel idea that they'd like to pursue, then they can always try me out and see if I'm going to bite. Probably the best way to get in touch is to use my contact form on Aura Lab Studios, which is .myportfolio.com. And I imagine you'll drop that in the details on the video.
Absolutely, folks. You know how this works. Check the description, and we will have the relevant link available for you. No, folks, you may not go and take this music and use it for your own purposes, because that's why we went through this whole process. That's why we commissioned the music. So it's mine. It's not yours. I mean, obviously it's Lee's, but the whole point of this is that the ownership resides with the podcast. The creative genius is Lee's. I don't know quite what that means in terms of who owns the copyright, but basically it's us, hands off. No, you can't have it.
I would say on that front, it is entirely yours. It's your music.
There we go. It's mine. It's my music now, even though
It belongs
if
to
you
Zach.
if you sat me down for 1,000 years, I could never compose what you've listened to. Lee, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute joy to talk you through this, but also crucially to work with you.
Thank you.
So in terms of the future of this show and what this music means for the engagement, like this is such a gift, and it has been a real pleasure to go on this creative journey with you. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope that, if there are further projects that you want to pursue and you need more music, that you'll head my way.
Or hold that thought, because there is a rumor that I'm heading out to Spain and
Um,
Portugal in a couple of weeks in order to film, or at least start filming, Peninsula War by Air, which admittedly won't actually make its way onto the channel until at least 2026. But there's a tantalizing prospect for the future. Folks, you've been listening to Meet the Author, or rather Meet the Composer, an episode that is usually part of an exclusive series to our Patreon supporters. If you'd like to know more, links in the description. You can find out more on patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod. But for now, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your comments and questions, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Flewick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlem, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.